Fox News studio in Manhattan, Zambia, with the typical energy of a live broadcast. It was a cold night of October 2025, and Barron Trump, now 19 years old and a student of international relations at Georgetown, was about to make his first major appearance as a political commentator high as the 198 meters. His father, Barron, had inherited not only Donald Trump's physical stature, but also his tendency toward controversial statements. Unlike his father, however, he had opted for a more intellectual approach, studying political science and presenting himself as the new conservative American generation. "We are living 3, 2, 1, murmured the studio director. "Good night, I'm Tucker Carlson. And today, we have with us a young man who has drawn attention in conservative circles," the presenter announced. Barron Trump, son of the 47th President of the United States, is here to discuss the situation in West Africa. Barron adjusted his red tie, a deliberate choice to echo Republican colors, and smiled confidently to the cameras. "Thanks for having me here, Tucker. It's time for someone to tell the truth about what is happening in Africa, on the other side of the world." In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was in a meeting with his Council of Ministers when his communication advisor, Major Dabao, hurried in. President Darabao said, using the title Ibrahim had taken on after the democratic elections of the previous year, "The former president's son is talking about you on American television." Ibrahim, now 36 years old and officially president of Burkina Faso, raised his eyebrows. "The young Trump. What does he have to say about our country, sir?" "Maybe the Lord is better to see for himself," Darabao replied, linking a tablet to show the live broadcast of Fox News on the screen. Barron was emphatically gesturing. "Tucker, this Tro Ibrahim is exactly the kind of African leader who does not understand how the modern world works. He thinks he can challenge the established global order, but is just damaging his own people." Ibrahim leaned forward, interested. At 36, he had faced presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders, but being criticized by an American teenager was a new experience. "Keep watching," he said to his advisor. "This can be interesting." Barron was clearly comfortable in front of the cameras, talking with the confidence of someone who grew up under the media spotlight. "Look, Tucker," he continued, gesturing widely, "my father tried to teach these African leaders real business, how to attract American investments, but they prefer to make anti-American speeches to impress the masses." Tucker Carlson leaned forward. "Barron, are you specifically referring to the Tro president of Burkina Faso?" "Exactly," Barron exclaimed, his eyes shining with the certainty of youth. "This guy is 36 years old, just 17 years older than me, and thinks he knows more about global economy than generations of American leaders. It's laughable, really." He took a dramatic break, clearly enjoying the attention. "Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in the world, Tucker. They have gold, natural resources, but remain poor. Why? Because their leaders prefer to blame the West rather than doing hard work to build solid institutions." In the studio, some aides exchanged nervous looks, even for Fox News standards. Barron's comments were becoming particularly provocative. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim watched in silence, but his ministers began to rummage restlessly. "President," said the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Fatou Sankara, "should we respond to these provocations?" Ibrahim raised his hand, asking for silence. "Let me hear what else he has to say." On TV, Barron continued, "And another thing, Tucker. Ibrahim Tro talks about African sovereignty and national dignity. But where was this dignity when he took power through a military coup? He only organized elections after international impression was unbearable." Tucker smiled, feeling that he had a commentator who would generate buzz. "So you think the United States should take a firmer position?" "Absolutely," Barron answered, his voice rising a tone. "These young African leaders need to understand that respect is achieved through results, not through cheap anti-Western rhetoric." That's when Ibrahim slowly stood from his chair. "Major Darrow," he said calmly, "schedule a live broadcast for tomorrow. It's time to educate this young man about some realities." The next morning, while Barron Trump woke up at his Dormitory in Georgetown. Pleased with the 2.3 million views his clip had achieved on YouTube. Ibrahim Traoré had been awake for 3 hours preparing his answer. President, said his head of communication, we have refurbishment of 5 American networks wanting their answer to the statements of young Trump, CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News itself. Ibrahim smiled. No, let's do differently. Let's make our own live broadcast directly from Ouagadougou. I want the world to see where I'm talking from. At 14 hours local time, Ibrahim was sitting in his presidential office with the flag of Burkina Faso behind him and, through the window, a view of the capital, Burkina Faso. 5 cameras were strategically positioned to capture not only Ibrahim, but also glimpses of the city under development outside. My brothers and sisters, not just Burkina Faso but from all over the world. Ibrahim started speaking, first in French then moving to perfect English. Yesterday, a young American made some observations about me and my country on American television. Usually, I would not respond to comments from someone who is still at university. He paused, his smile revealing that there was more to come. But Mr. Barron Trump's words reveal a mindset that we need to approach directly. Not because it is important, but because the ignorance he has shown is unfortunately shared by many privileged young people in the West. In Georgetown, Barron was watching the broadcast with his bedroom colleagues, initially confident. He began to frown when he noticed Ibrahim's respectful but firm tone. First, Ibrahim continued, Mr. Trump suggested that I do not understand global economy. Let me share some facts. Since I took over the presidency, Burkina Faso has increased its 340% processed gold production. Our GDP has grown 8%. Over the past year, we reduced dependence on 60% food imports. He leaned forward, looking straight into the camera. These are concrete results, Mr. Trump, non-rhetoric results. Ibrahim got up from his chair and walked to a bookcase full of books and documents. Second point. Mr. Trump questioned my national dignity for assuming power through a military coup. It is an interesting criticism from someone whose grandfather made a fortune by managing brothels during the gold rush in Canada, and whose father was accused of trying to overthrow American democratic elections. The blow was accurate and devastating. In the U.S., several people watching their beverages spit or laughed involuntarily. But let's talk about real dignity, Ibrahim continued. Returning to his chair, when I assumed power, Burkina Faso had 40% of her population hungry. Today this number is less than 8%. When I arrived, 70% of our children did not have access to primary education. Today, 95% are in school. He paused, letting the numbers echo. This, Mr. Trump, is dignity. Dignity is to ensure that mothers do not see their children starving. Dignity is to build schools and hospitals, not towers with their name on them. In Georgetown, Barron was visibly uncomfortable. His colleagues began to whisper with each other, some laughing softly. From the points marked by Ibrahim. Third point, Ibrahim continued. Mr. Trump said I need to understand how the modern world works. Let me educate you about how the world really works. Ibrahim got up again and walked to a large window that showed a horizon. Burkina Faso produces gold that sells for $1,800 the ounce in the international market. Before my presidency, we sold raw gold for $400 the ounce to Western companies that refined and resold. Now we refine our gold and sell for the actual market price. He turned to face the camera again. This is $1,400 more for Burkina Faso, hiring Burkinabe, building our economy. This is how the modern world should work, Mr. Trump. Justice, not exploitation. Ibrahim returned to his table, but this time he didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned his hands on the table and leaned forward, his posture transmitting total seriousness. Now, Mr. Barron Trump, I will give you a lesson that was apparently not taught in Georgetown. The tone of Ibrahim had changed subtly still, respectful, but now loaded with an authority that had been leading a country in crisis. You said, I'm only 17 years older than you, as if that were a disqualification. Let me tell you what I did in these 17 years. Ibrahim began to count on his fingers. At 19, my current age, I was serving as a soldier protecting villages against terrorist attacks. At 22, I was officially leading rescue operations of kidnapped children. At 25, I was coordinating humanitarian operations in refugee camps. Each word was pronounced accurately, each age marking an experience that dramatically contrasted with Barron's privileged life at 30. I had lost 23 friends in combat against terrorists who threatened our people. At 33, I took responsibility for 22 million Burkinabe. And you, Mr. Trump, what did you do at 19? The question went on the air like a bomb about to explode. In Georgetown, the silence in Barron's dorm was deafening. His colleagues could no longer hide the embarrassment. They felt for him. While you were in expensive private schools, Ibrahim continued, I was learning to lead men in combat. While you were on golf courses, I was in battlefields. While you were worried about Instagram followers, I was worried about keeping people alive. Ibrahim paused, letting the contrast sink. So, when you talk about results versus rhetoric, Mr. Trump, I ask, what are your results besides being born in a rich family? What have you ever achieved by your own merit? The question was devastating in its simplicity and brutal honesty. Ibrahim was not over. He walked to a wall where photos of development projects were hung in Burkina Faso, schools, hospitals, farms, refineries. You mentioned that Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in the world. As if this were my fault or my people's, Ibrahim said, his voice gaining a controlled passion. Let me teach a little history, as apparently this was not covered in your international relations classes. He pointed to a West African map on the wall. For 60 years, France has extracted uranium, gold, and other funds from Burkina Faso, paying ridiculously low prices. For 60 years, we were forced to keep our financial reserves at French banks, gaining minimal interest, while France used our money to finance its own development. Ibrahim turned to face the camera directly. For 60 years, Mr. Trump, the global system that his family celebrates, both has maintained countries like mine poor, not out of incompetence, but by design. And in 3 years, we changed this dynamic that had been unchanged in 6 decades. In Georgetown, Barron was visibly pale. Some of his colleagues began to leave the room, clearly embarrassed by association. You talked about attracting American investments. Ibrahim continued, here's news for you. We don't need investments that keep us dependent. We need partnerships that make us independent. Ibrahim returned to his table and took a document. This year, Burkina Faso has signed technological partnership agreements with China, India, Brazil, and yes, the United States, but all under our terms. Not as begging, but as a negotiation between equals. He looked straight at the camera, as if looking straight into Barron's eyes. And you know why we get that, Mr. Trump? Because when you represent 22 million people who trust you, you quickly learn that your personal dignity is less than their future. While Ibrahim continued his systematic and devastating response, Barron Trump was going through the worst 20 minutes of his young public life. His phone kept vibrating with notifications. Ibrahim's broadcast was becoming viral in real time. To Politics Today tweet, Ibrahim Traoré is giving a leadership masterclass to Barron Trump. This is live education on Africism. Posted, a 36-year-old man who leads a country is teaching history and economy to a 19-year-old boy. What a moment in the Fox News studio. Tucker Carlson was receiving urgent instructions at his point of view. The network was being bombarded with requests for Barron to respond live. Barron, Tucker said by phone, you need to come to the studio now. This situation is getting out of control. Barron, surrounded by colleagues who now looked at him with a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment, knew he had to do something. The young man who had grown up seeing his father recovering from controversies decided to try the same tactic. 2 hours later, Barron was back in Fox News' studio, visibly nervous but trying to maintain composure. Tucker, he started, his voice no longer carrying the arrogant confidence from 2 days ago. I want to clarify some points about my previous comments. No, Barron, Tucker interrupted. Ibrahim Traoré basically demolished your points, arguments by point. How do you respond to this? Barron swallowed hard. It was obvious to any viewer he was out of his league. Look, Tucker, I think, maybe I don't have all the information about the situation in Burkina Faso, he started, his voice faltering. It was the first crack in the facade. President Traoré. He made some valid points about the historical challenges his country faced. Tucker leaned forward, feeling blood in the water. Barron, are you retreating from your original statements? No, not exactly retreating, Barron responded quickly but then paused. I would like to have a private conversation with President Traoré to better understand his perspective. Oh, what Barron didn't know was that Ibrahim was watching the live broadcast of his attempted damage control. When I learned that Barron had asked for a private conversation, Ibrahim decided to give a last public lesson. Major Dabao. Ibrahim said, call Fox News. I will accept talking to young Trump, but live, not in private. 30 minutes later, something unprecedented was happening on American television. A live debate between the president of Burkina Faso talking about Ouagadougou and the former president's son in Fox News. Studio in New York, President Traoré, Barron, began trying to recover some dignity. Thanks for accepting this conversation, Mr. Trump. Ibrahim answered in a calm but firm voice, education must be public. If you want to learn about real leadership, the whole world can benefit from the lesson. Barron took a deep breath. President, maybe I was very hard in my initial comments. Perhaps, Ibrahim repeated. Mr. Trump, you called my leadership. I said I don't understand global economy. He questioned my national dignity. And now you say maybe I was very hard. The difference between the two was glaring. On the one hand, an experienced leader speaking to the authority of those who govern a country. On the other, a privileged young man clearly outside his depth. President Traoré, Barron continued, his voice now visibly fluttering. I would like to apologize for any offense my comments may have caused. Any offense they may have caused, Ibrahim repeated, echoing the classic non-sorry. Mr. Trump, you not just offended me, you offended 22 million Burkinabés who work every day to build a better country. Barron realized that he was sinking more with each word. President, you are right. I shouldn't have talked about matters I don't understand completely. Finally, Ibrahim said an honest statement. Ibrahim leaned forward, deciding to transform this embarrassing moment into something constructive. Mr. Trump, I will give you advice that can help you for the rest of your life, he said, his voice taking an almost paternal tone. Real leadership does not come from arrogance or cradle, it comes from service. Barron nodded silently, clearly without words. You are 19 years old and access to resources that 99% of young people in the world do not have, Ibrahim continued. The question is what are you going to do with these privileges? Will you use them to attack people who work or to improve their people's lives? Or will you use them to really make a difference? The camera captured Barron swallowing hard. President Traoré, he said, his now genuinely humble voice. I would like to visit Burkina Faso to learn to see myself the work you are doing for myself. Ibrahim smiled for the first time throughout the exchange. Mr. Trump, you will be welcome in Burkina Faso, but not as a tourist or son of former president. You will be welcome as a student and hear students' work. I accept, Barron answered immediately. Great, Ibrahim said. You can start by helping to build a school in one of our rural communities. Real physical work. No photo ops. Tucker Carlson, realizing that he had completely lost control of the narrative, tried to intervene. Well, gentlemen, it seems that, Tucker, Ibrahim interrupted him politely. Let the young man answer. Young man answer. This is an important decision for him. Barron looked straight at the camera. He transmitted to Ouagadougou. President Traoré, I accept his conditions. I want to learn what real leadership means. 3 months later, a photo circulated through social networks that few could have imagined. Barron Trump, sweaty and covered with dust, carrying bricks for building a primary school in a rural village of Burkina Faso. Beside him, Burkinabe children ran and played, some stopping to help the American young man who could barely pronounce bonjour when he arrived. How do you feel? He asked a BBC journalist who was documenting the experience. Barron, now visibly thinner and tanned by the African sun, thought for a moment before answering. Humiliated, he said honestly, in a good way. I learned more about leadership in 3 months here than in 19 years in the United States. Ibrahim, who had arrived to inspect the progress of the school, heard the comment and approached Mr. Trump. He said, extending his hand, "You worked hard. The children of this community will have a school in part to your work." Barron squeezed Ibrahim's hand, but this time there were no Fox News cameras. There was no controlled studio atmosphere. It was just two men, a young man learning, another teaching. President Traoré Barron said, "Thanks for not giving up on me, for giving me this opportunity. Everyone deserves a chance to grow," Ibrahim replied. But growth requires humility. That night, in his diary that he had started writing at the suggestion of Ibrahim, Barron wrote, "Today I understood the difference between privilege and merit. Privilege is what you receive, merit is what you get. For 19 years, I confused both." 6 months later, Barron had transferred his studies to the University of Ouagadougou, where he was learning French and studying international development. His posts on Instagram, once full of expensive cars and parties, now showed community projects and smiling children. A year later, he had co-founded an NGO focused on rural education in West Africa, partially funded with his own allowance, but mainly through genuine funding. 2 years later, when Ibrahim Traoré visited the United States for a UN meeting, Barron was there to receive him not as a son of a former president, but as a developing partner. President Barron said during dinner that live broadcast was the best thing that has ever happened to me. Ibrahim smiled. Sometimes we need to be broken to be rebuilt the right way. The true legacy of that viral confrontation was not the public humiliation of an arrogant young man, but his transformation into someone who understood that real leadership means serving others, not being used for others. And in Burkina Faso, in the schools that Barron had helped build, children learned an important lesson, that growing means admitting when you're wrong and having the courage to change.